This is the 8th screencast, and we reached the fifth and final part of the 5 topics that we wanted to cover in the nervous system lectures. And this is the physiology of motor systems. So we're going to concentrate here on the somatic or the motor nervous system. And by its very nature, a motor system is involved in movement. And so first of all, the question which I might ask if this was a face-to-face lecture is, why is movement important? So maybe from a physiological point of view, if we think about a baby at birth, a baby is obviously not capable of moving around freely and doing what we call goal-orientated movements. However, physiologically, a baby of any mammalian species has some kind of coordinated movement. And again, this might sound a little bit odd, but central to human development is the ability to overcome gravity. So what we want to do in order to evolve, to develop, in this case as a human being, is to be able to overcome gravity. So essentially what this means is, if we took a baby and we put it on a table in front of us, in theory, if we went away for a couple of hours, obviously it's not a good thing to do, but if we went away for a couple of hours, the baby would still be lying there. If we put a toddler onto a table, or a 2-year-old or something like that, that would be very dangerous, because maybe a toddler or a 2-year-old will physiologically develop the ability to overcome gravity, and then is going to get up and is going to fall off the table. So the ability to overcome gravity, said here, sitting, standing, walking, running, jumping, then developing more complex movements, is a key attribute to human development. And in order to do that, we need a developed motor system, a system of nerves and muscles that we can coordinate in order to move properly. Of course, what we're also interested in, and one of the reasons that humans have developed as maybe a superior species, is because we've developed precise movements, in particular in terms of vocalization. So we want to vocalize by moving muscles in the larynx, and also we want to have complex manipulations, skilled use of tools. All of these things are inherent in a useful motor system, and are the reasons that we've developed as maybe the predominant species. As I alluded to, these tasks can be seen as fulfilling 2 major functions: the maintenance of posture, so that we don't, fall over, and goal-directed movements, so that we can carry out complex manipulations and speech. And both of these 2 attributes, maintenance of posture and goal-directed movements in particular, are dictated by the somatic or the motor nervous system. It's under higher control or hierarchical control of both spinal and central divisions of the central nervous system. So there are 2 things to consider. Firstly, spinal control, and secondly, central control. We'll deal with spinal control quite quickly, because spinal control is basically our reflexes. Spinal reflexes are things that we don't think about, they're unconscious, and we're born with them. So they're inherited. It's an inherited hardwire system, and these spinal reflexes allow a baby to maintain some kind of posture, and obviously we use spinal reflexes unconsciously, but all the time, in order to maintain our posture, in order for us to survive as well. So we'll consider spinal control in the next slide very briefly, and then we'll talk a little bit more about central control. So central control are the regions of the brain that we talked about back in Screencast 1. In particular, things like the cerebrum, the cerebral hemispheres, the thalamus, which is our sense processing organ in the brain, cerebellum, which dictates control of movement, as does basal ganglia. And all of these parts of the brain essentially control our somatic nervous system. In general, the function is to control goal-directed movements. As I said, first of all, we'll just consider spinal control, and then we'll come back for the rest of the 2 podcasts to consider central control in a little bit more detail. So spinal control, as we said, is unconscious. We're not thinking about, spinal reflexes are unconscious. We're not thinking about reflex actions. By their very nature, they're rapid, and we're doing them all the time. We're not thinking about them. They're not under central control. They're not under control of consciousness or will. Tend to have, in terms of the synaptic pathways, they tend to be quite basic. So they have few synapses, which means that they can be fast. So we want spinal reflexes to be very rapid. They serve a protective or survival function. So we need to maintain posture in order to survive. They're inherited as a hardwire system, as I said. We're born with spinal reflexes in place. We don't learn them. But they are modulated by the central nervous system. And again, this maybe is something just to focus on, just to explain. If we cut through the spinal, essentially through the spinal column, through the brainstem, if we cut the central nervous system input into the spine, actually, instead of this you might expect that gets rid of all of our reflex system. Instead, what we tend to get is continual motor activity. So what this tells us is that normally the central nervous system is modulated and is probably inhibiting motor activity. So it's controlling motor activity. If we cut that input from the central nervous system, actually we get ongoing motor activity. So this tells us that usually we're under a situation of inhibition of control from the central nervous system, and if we cut the input into it, we lose that inhibition. So like I said, we need to know about spinal reflexes, or we need to appreciate that they're there, that they're important in, as we said, posture. But what we're really concerned with for the rest of the 2 podcasts is goal-directed movement and the neural input into neuromuscular junctions. And as I said, we'll pick up the muscular side of the neuromuscular junction when we talk about muscle physiology in the next set of screencasts. Again, so this is another placeholder slide. We've considered the central nervous system, we've considered the autonomic nervous system. In this set of podcasts, we're now focusing on the somatic, or sometimes called the motor nervous system. Under conscious control, dictates these goal-directed movements. And again, another placeholder slide. We've considered the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. What we're going to do now is focus on the somatic nervous system, and in particular on acetylcholine acting at nicotinic receptors and innervating neuromuscular junctions found in skeletal muscle. Again, as I keep saying, we'll talk about the neuromuscular junction and the muscle side of it in the next set of screencasts. So make sure that you understand the neural input and that you can explain that as well as the muscular side of the neuromuscular junction. Essentially, the somatic nervous system works by a motor neuron. Again, we showed you a diagram of a motor neuron back in one of the earlier screencasts, and they control skeletal muscle fibers. And because a motor neuron is inputted into a muscle fiber, we call this a motor system. And again, maybe just to re-emphasize what I've said over the last few slides, the somatic nervous system is under control of both spinal and central divisions of the CNS. We need these ongoing unconscious reflex actions, but we also need central control. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. So this is a section through the spinal cord. I showed you a similar diagram earlier on. This is really just to focus in on these motor neurons. Again, we showed you a diagram of what a typical neuron looks like, and we often use a motor neuron as our typical example. And again, maybe just to tie this all up, motor neuron cell bodies are found in this ventral root. Remember, these are the dorsal roots, these are the ventral roots. In this diagram, the ventral roots are shown on the bottom here. Motor neuron dendrites again, that we showed you before, receive this convergent information from a number of sources. So something called proprioceptors, we'll talk about these over the next few slides. Recurrent collaterals, and again, maybe I showed you the fact that collaterals are these smaller nerve fibers that emerge from from this principal motor axon, and also some descending fibers from the brain. And again, as I mentioned before, if we cut the descending fiber input, because these are all the fibers mainly run through the brain stem, then we see that we get this ongoing motor activity. Motor neurons axons exit via the ventral root of the spinal cord, maybe as we said before. This would be the dorsal root with reference to that previous diagram. This is the ventral root, so we get efferent fibers coming out of the central nervous system and innervating the neuromuscular junctions. Yeah, I'm just going to describe proprioception. Again, if we were doing a face-to-face lecture, I might get you to actually do this task, but just to define what proprioception is, it's defined as the perception of self. And maybe the best way to think about this is if our proprioception is working properly, it means that we can maintain posture and we can maintain goal-directed movements. So at the moment, I'm kind of sitting in front of my computer screen. I'm not standing up at the front of the lecture, but my proprioception is such that I know where I am in relation to the screen, where I am in relation to the seat that I'm sitting on. I'm not slouching down, hopefully. I'm sitting nice and straight because my proprioception is working okay. And proprioception is said to be a two-way process. We've got two proprioceptors. So I mentioned proprioceptors on the previous slide. What exactly are these receptors, essentially, that are involved in the sensing of proprioception? Effectively, they're two components of the muscle. And we're going to talk about these, as I said, in a little bit more detail in muscle physiology, but muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs are our two main receptors that signal this proprioceptive information to our brain. Briefly, muscle spindles respond to stretch, so tell us something about how much tension we have to or how much stretch we have to put on our muscles, whereas the Golgi tendon organs tell us a little bit about tension. And again, if you're standing up, your muscles are under a different tension than when you're sitting down. If you're reaching out, you've got different aspects of stretch, and these two receptors essentially signal to the central nervous system about these different aspects of muscle movement. Motor neurons, which we're going to focus on today, signal to skeletal muscle, and yeah, have a look at the muscle physiology lectures, as I've been saying, just to get the muscle side of this. This is a slide that I've taken from a lecture about muscle physiology, and it just shows you where the muscle spindles, and these are the spindles shown here. You can see the label. These are the spindles inside the muscle, and the Golgi tendon organs down here. The tendons essentially are the parts of the muscle, as you may know already, that respond to tension. So let's just finish it off. As I said, you know, if we were in the lecture theatre now, perhaps I would get you to do this. You can try this. This is an activity that you can try at home, and essentially, if you want to test that your proprioception is working fine, this is what you do. So you can stand up. You can do this at home if you like. You can pause the screencast after you've read the instructions. Close both eyes. Balance on one foot. This part is optional. Touch the tip of your nose with both index fingers. So maybe if I just try the last bit of this. So I'm going to shut my eyes, and can I touch the end of my nose with both index fingers? Yes, I can. So that means my proprioception is okay. And actually, the reason I'm telling you this is because if your proprioception is disrupted, it will mean that you can't actually correctly locate your nose, so you might poke yourself in the eye, and you might in particular have very shaky fingers. And essentially, this is a test of balance and movement. Essentially, that's why sometimes you're asked to stand on one foot and close both eyes. And if you have diseases that affect parts of the central nervous system that are involved in proprioception, in particular the cerebellum. Cerebellum is something that coordinates movement and balance. So if you've got some damage to the cerebellum, there's a disease called ataxia, which is characterized by very, shaky fingers if you hold your finger up in front of you. And it's basically because the cerebellum is very important in coordination of movement. And ataxia is a disease that would affect your proprioception. Unfortunately, for some people that do suffer from ataxia, one of the signs is very much like you're inebriated, like you're drunk, you've had too much alcohol. And the reason for that is alcohol tends to work on the same neurons that are involved in proprioception. So if you drink too much alcohol, you become drunk, you'll notice that one of the kind of characteristics of people that are drunk is their movement and balance becomes disrupted. And so for this reason, I'd probably ask you, right, did you poke yourself in the eye? Did you fall over? If you did, you may have a problem with proprioception. If you didn't, your proprioception is fine. And where might you have seen this test before? This basic test is something called a field sobriety test. And the place that you might have seen a field sobriety test is, if you're driving along and somebody, or hopefully not you, but somebody has been pulled over to the side of the road by the police. What they might, and they've been asked to, balance on one foot, or more commonly, maybe walk in a straight line. If the police suspect somebody of being drunk on alcohol or maybe some, drugs, they'll often give them this field sobriety test. Usually they're looking for, abuse of alcohol. Alcohol impairs proprioception, so you might fail a field sobriety test. So if you want to test your proprioception, have a go at that. That's probably a good, that's an activity associated with this screencast. That's a good place to end this screencast, and then we'll go on to talk about we'll go on to finish on about the physiology of nervous systems in the final screencast.